This is, I won't go through this again, but I would talk about the borders on this one, but I want to show you this. Now, here's the way we think about Afghanistan, or have for the last 20 years. Okay, this is the mid-19th century map. This is the way we think about Afghanistan. So when you see it up on the map or you see it in the news, they have these nice little lines drawn around it, and it looks like a state, right? It looks like you have the state that sits at the center of all of these critical areas, and that is really, really strategic in its placement, which you would think would give it some geopolitical value. This is really what Afghanistan looks like, though. This is an ethnic and linguistic breakdown of what the country looks like. And if you look at the areas, in fact, it's totally, the lines drawn on the map are totally artificial. In fact, the areas that you find within Afghanistan are all really more a part of something else, whether it's the Shia over in Iran, whether it's the Turkmens up, or the Uzbekis, or the Tajiks. And then, of course, then you have all of the Pashtun. It's really more a part of something else than it is a part of a cohesive whole, a state that's a holistic state. I was a part of a briefing for the commander at Soxent. This was 5 years ago. We were talking about Yemen. And we were talking about the Saudi incursion into Yemen and what we should do or what we shouldn't do, because they were putting together a plan. And what I told them was, you can put 1 million troops on the ground in Yemen, and I know. I spent 2 years there. Or Afghanistan, for that matter. You can leave them for 1,000 years, and when you remove them, you'll have little or nothing to show for it. It will go back to being Afghanistan or Yemen or whatever. I mean, look at our adventure in Iraq. Look at our adventure in Afghanistan, okay? You have to pick, sometimes you have to get involved in something where there's not really, where there's not really a way to solve the problem, but you have to be there to protect your interests. I would argue that Iraq, after we destroyed it, we really have to be there to protect our interests. I would argue that Afghanistan is something entirely different. Let's talk about history. Imposing foreign rule or foreign system or foreign control in Afghanistan from Alexander the Great to us has failed every time, simply because it is a geographic term, not a state, has never been a state. Next. It has little value. So people will talk about it and say it's strategic, or we got to worry about terrorism, or we've got a lot of areas where we need to worry, where we have to worry about terrorism, but it really has little strategic value. I mean, their main cash product is opium, right? I mean, why would you expend 20 years and $2 trillion trying to fix something that's probably unfixable? Withdrawal things. Now, I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about from whether it's the Persians, whether it's Alexander, whether it's the British, whether it's the Russians. It comes down to this. It's flat not worth the effort to try to occupy the place. There is no value added that comes out of it. There is never an end game. And you never really change anything. The British failed 3 times. I have these illustrations. The first time, 1839 to 1842, is when one little survivor straggled out of the Khyber Pass. They wiped out entire British regiments, the tribal types. Again, in 1878 to 1880, they tried to set up a center. In some ways, it paralleled what we did, and that is you've got the center where you're able to project power, et cetera, et cetera. But after 2 years, everybody looked around and said, what are we doing and what are we gaining from this? And the British really, for the most part, ran their empire on an ROI, return on investment. If there was no real gain there, somebody would sit down and start counting the pounds in London, and they'd say, we need to rethink this. And then in 1919, they had another revolt. And at this point, the Viceroy of India said, we're going to establish what we call the Durand Line, which is more or less still the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, but it doesn't reflect the reality on the ground because you got Pashtuns on both sides of the border. But we said we're going to establish this line, and what we're going to do is we're going to contain the problem. So all those old movies that you see of the British Raj, where the guys are out on the frontier trying to hold the line again, this is where they originated in this attempt to hold and contain the problems that come out of Afghanistan. Now let's talk about the Soviet adventures in Afghanistan. Remember I said it was really fractured? Any institution, quote, institution that you find in Afghanistan is really fractured among various groups that are competing for power. The Communist Party, you've got all of these groups, and you can boil it down to the Communist Party, which is a relatively small group of people in Afghanistan, almost besieged on all sides by other groups. And yet they themselves were so divided against each other. The Russians, fearing unrest in its Muslim republics of the South, decided that they needed to go into Afghanistan and establish a friendly government there, and they installed the Afghan Communist Party. In 1978, one of the factions in the Communist Party eliminated the guys that the Russians installed. And the guy that the Russians installed, although he was a communist too, was a big critic of Brezhnev, right? 1979, Brezhnev sends the Russian army in there. They kill the guy that replaced the other guy and put another guy in charge, right? Okay, got it? You see how fractured this is, no matter what you do. I mean, these guys are supposed to be reliable ideologues, but they're so intent on their own political gain and their own political, that the factions split it into multiple pieces, even in a very small organization, relatively small organization like the Communist Party. And so I put that operation up there. When the Soviet army came in and they killed Amin, it sounds like some name we would have dreamed up for an operation, Operation Storm 333, right? Well, it would turn out to be a storm. The Soviets would learn the hard way. In this, now you have an internal civil war and competition between two different groups, with two different main groups within the Communist Party. And you've got the countryside fighting the invaders, fighting both parts of the Communist Party, the Russians, and they're doing it because the Russians are trying to bring reform, socialist reform and secular government to people that don't want to be secular and don't want to be reformed. USSR's Vietnam. They are defeated by us, who use the Muslim fundamentalists, arm them, hand them Stinger missiles, and bleed the Soviet Union to death. They literally could not afford the war. The war was simply too much for their system. And so as a result, they collapsed. And we use Muslim fundamentalist allies to defeat them. Now, from this comes some real extremist groups like Al-Qaeda, who hated us even during the war effort. But nevertheless, we use Islamic groups to defeat the Soviet Union and basically bring an end to the Soviet Empire. In a series of civil wars, everybody backs out. The Taliban takes over. They're friends with Al-Qaeda, who has been building relationships in the government and intermarrying, and they get declared a terrorist organization. And we attempt some covert attacks to neutralize them. But if you'll recall, those attacks were generated by the Clinton administration. And every time Bill Clinton did something, everybody accused him, if you remember the movie Wag the Dog, everybody accused him of trying to distract attention from his problems with Monica Lewinsky and others, okay? And so he was constantly under political attack every time he did something. And then the other part was they were just flat timid. And I mean, everybody was timid. CIA didn't want to arm drones because they were worried about the legal implications of attacking people with drones. When they had a real opportunity to assassinate Osama bin Laden, they forced them to use automatic weapons and no RPGs because RPGs were too violent, which I always found kind of entertaining. You're trying to kill the guy, right? And so whether you kill him with an RPG or, or an AK-47 doesn't make any difference. It's pretty violent. But really, this is the kind of thinking. But the problem was that it was a political hot button back here. Anything you did got you severely criticized in the thing. And many Republicans who would end up supporting both the Afghan thing and the Iraqi invasion were a party to that. And the Democrats too, for that matter. So 9/11, everybody gets a wake-up call, right? Al-Qaeda is really, really a problem. Allies get on board, everybody gets on board. We literally go in and to destroy Al-Qaeda, and everybody is on board, Al-Qaeda and the Afghan regime. Tremendous opportunity to get everybody behind us. The Taliban is defeated. The Taliban government is destroyed. Al-Qaeda is sent into hiding literally within a matter of 2 or 3 months. Now, it costs billions, but billions aren't trillions, right? And it was a handful of special operations guys and a handful of CIA guys with B-52s. We can argue from now until doomsday about whether or not you should have put more troops on the ground to actually try to get Osama bin Laden so we weren't chasing him around for 10 years. But nevertheless, we destroyed the regime and destroyed their base within 3 months. Then we shift our focus. In the middle of this, with everybody on board, we shift our focus to Iraq, imagining that Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, imagining that, that somehow to get rid of Saddam in Iraq, this was going to improve the stability of the region, okay? And then Paul Bremer, the genius that they sent to run the thing, decides to disband the Iraqi army, which was the only national institution in all of Iraq. And so the whole thing collapses. I don't need to tell anybody in this room what flowed out of that. At the same time, in Afghanistan, the government that emerged, we used to laugh and say in the colonial environment, the people that held the narratives were the people that could speak English, whether they had any real power or not. And so Hamid Karzai becomes the guy that the focus becomes on because they think he's going to unite the, Afghanistan into some sort of federalist republic that's going to work. And actually you have elections and you incredibly corrupt, top to bottom. Our money being wasted, them, it's all about their personal political position and not really being able to pull something together because these guys know Afghanistan and know they can't. Karzai knows that from his ethnic group to another ethnic group, he's hated. So this is where we end up. And then in 2006, we end up with airstrikes that killed some of the leaders and we get really hopped up about it. But we're also killing a lot of civilians. And so gradually, we become identified with the corrupt Kabul government and the terrorist operations and recruitment jumps. And these guys would really fight you. I mean, when you went after them, they maneuvered and they went after you. They were really, really tenacious fighters. We became the enemy. 2009, Obama runs on a thing that we lost our way in Iraq. And by 2008, 2009, I was in Iraq with 101st Airborne in 2008. And, I had the unenviable position of being asked in front of a command conference, so what are we going to get out of this after the surge? And I thought, well, you guys are grown up, nothing. We're really going to have nothing to show for this. And when we look back at it historically, we're going to say that Iran won the Iraq war. And I mean, it's a tough message, but that's exactly what happened. So Obama ran on a thing that we focused on the wrong thing. We should have focused on Iraq. He wanted to do a surge. He thought that he could go to the military, do a surge, stabilize Afghanistan, just as we had kind of stabilized a little bit Iraq, and would be able to move on from there. We still had no legitimacy. The elections were looked as corrupt. The government was corrupt. And by the time Trump arrives on the scene, this is one thing he had right, absolutely right. He wants out. He sees no upside to continuing this thing in Afghanistan on the drain. But it's a matter of focus. I mean, you really had to be able to pull the pin and make a hard decision. And that always got put off. The hard decision always got put off. So he decides to stay, but he opts for allowing the Qataris in Doha to engineer these talks with the Taliban about the US withdrawing. So what message does that send? The Americans are going to be gone. The Taliban goes around to everybody and says, you know what? It doesn't make any difference what they say. They're looking for a way out. They're going to find a way out, and you're going to be left holding the bag, so you better make a deal with us. This went on for that entire period. And you can't blame them. It's pretty smart on part of the Taliban, and everybody else could look at it and see what was going to happen. Biden, who had originally opposed the surge, finally says enough and pulls the pin. And we have a whole manner of people running around with their hair on fire about what happened at Kabul airport and why you should have done this or you should have done that. I actually think somebody had to do that. I'm actually shocked that the situation didn't end up a whole lot worse than it was. Okay, let's talk about kind of how we got there and views of Afghanistan. If you go back to 2001 or so and you look at Al-Qaeda, they'll tell you that our big mistake, one, we allowed Afghanistan to be a terrorist haven, and two, that the West's departure in 1989 after the collapse of the Soviet Union was premature, and we should have stayed there and tried to turn it into a state and built schools and all these other, but to ignore it is what created the problem. My view of that is it wouldn't make any difference when you stayed or when you went. The first issue is absolutely correct. The second issue is no matter what you do, you have to bring it down to a local level if you're going to have any influence at all, because you can't administer the state. It's a patronage system. So to us, it's all corrupt. Sometimes a patronage system, when it's carried too far, as one Afghan general I know put it, stealing with one hand is patronage. Stealing with two hands is corruption, okay? And it's just the nature of the society, okay? It's not stealing in a patronage, but if it goes too far, you view these people, whoever's involved in the government loses credibility. So there was this idea that 1989 departure was a mistake. We had been there for 5 years, and I sat at a dinner one night, not a big fancy dinner, in a local fish place down on Tampa Bay with my special operations guys, because I was working for Joint Special Operations University. Two senior colonels who had then been there from the beginning. They were the most senior U.S. officers originally put on the ground there. Never wore a suit, never wore a uniform, always in a suit or their khakis for 2 years. And both of them said, we missed the opportunity. We need to get out now because we've already lost. 2006. Okay? And I mean, these guys were no shrinking violence. These are tough guys. But they were also smart. They knew what they were looking at. And they listed a whole series of reasons why. We're, at the present time, we're on the tipping point of becoming the enemy, as opposed to trying to help the different groups. Biden opposes the Obama surge, but we go ahead and our allies in the region, Saudi general point blank saying this is crazy. I don't know what you guys are doing. You can't fix that place. Okay, but we went ahead with it. I was at a thing in Key West, sponsored by Special Operations Command. There were three three Russian, it's old habit, I can't get out of the old thing. But there were three Russian generals there. And one of them was an old Spetsnaz officer. And I looked at him and I said, so this is about 2010, I guess. I said, so what do you think about this whole thing in Afghanistan? And he says, yeah, I said, you got any advice? He says, get out. And because he said, we've been there before. You did this to us. Remember what you did to us. Now it's going to happen to you. Okay. Saudi general, there is nothing of value. Big mistake. And he added, what are you guys thinking? Big mistake. There were all sorts of questions in special operations, but they were all down, you know, your yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, you go ahead and carry out your orders, right? You have to. That's the way the military works. But at another level, when you talk to the guys really involved, they were like, you know, there are so many problems, we're never going to get to where, you know, they actually, I believe, most of the guys that were really experienced, a lot of them, they were pretty pessimistic from about 2006, 2007 on. A lot of our allies, one British ally said it was a fool's errand, and it's widely viewed as a lost cause. We were trying nation building where there wasn't a nation to build. You get it? Women's rights. You can talk about women's rights. You can talk about all these things they were trying to do. And there's going to be a lot of problems because the Taliban is back. But that was always going to happen. We were always going to leave. And whatever we left in our wake, just like that lesson we had learned almost, what is it now, 45 years ago in a place called Vietnam. When you leave, the indigenous forces are really going to determine what the place is going to look like. And so this is my message, and this is what I repeat, is you cannot build a nation where there's no nation to build. In the big global thing, contain Russia, Chinese and Russian ambitions in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. I mean, I don't see how anybody can disagree with that. That's really what the big issues are. To maintain stability and security in the Gulf and protect the Arab Gulf states. Look, this right here represents about 30, maybe 30%, maybe more of the world's oil, maybe 40%. You have a reason to want to make sure this stays stable and problems here don't end up here, or problems here don't end up here. And you want to make sure that happens. This is something strategic because I don't care how much oil we have here out in West Texas or out in the Balkans. Oil companies don't care. It's a global market thing. You remove 20% because of instability. And guess what? You know that $3 a gallon we're not happy about now? Well, it's going to be 6 or 7. Every time something sneezes in the Gulf, it jumps up. If something really happened, that would be serious. Contain Iranian influence and attempt to resurrect the Persian Empire. If you're drafted into the Iranian army right now, despite all this talk about the Islamic Republic, et cetera, they take you out here and they take you down to Persepolis, the old capital of the Persian Empire. And that's where they take their soldiers and they talk about the great military tradition and how the Persians conquered the world, et cetera, or that one. And so that's really what the issue is. It's not that the Persians are inherently, it's not that the Iranians / Persians are inherently evil. It's just that they have a vision of themselves and a history that says we should be the dominant power in this region. And the only reason we're not is because the United States, first the British and now the United States, and sometimes the Russians in the past, have kept us from realizing our real heritage. I get it. I understand what they're saying, but I'm sorry, that flies directly against our interest And therefore, my interests collide with that. So I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that doesn't happen. That's the third priority, I would say. The last one for the region is to prevent the establishment of a radical Islamic state like almost happened here in Syria and Iraq. Now, here's the difference. You may not, okay, you can say Afghanistan, you can't fix it. You can also say Syria and Iraq, you can't fix it, okay? But Afghanistan is way over here, and Syria and Iraq is right here in a position to really upset a strategic commodity that we need. And so if you can put 4,000, 3,000 special forces on the ground and back them up with air from places like the new bases in Kuwait or in Qatar, et cetera, then you do it, because that's the cheaper option than the damage that would be done if you destabilize the Gulf. You see what I'm saying? We have an interest out there, but our strategic interest has almost nothing to do with Afghanistan. Now let's talk about what happened with this withdrawal. U.S. needed to withdraw. I mean, everybody agreed on that. Biden, Trump, you go down the whole list. Obama before that. Bush, by the second half of his terms in the White House, by the second term, he was looking for a way to get out too. Okay, so we got 20 years of effort, $2 trillion, and guess what? Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. Changes are superficial, and they are not fundamentally a part of the culture. Trump administration used the Qatar talks to get U.S. personnel out of the line of fire. One of the things that happened in the Qatar talks is we said, look, we'll talk to you, and the Qataris, but you quit attacking U.S. troops. And that's fundamentally what happened in Afghanistan. The entire focus of the Taliban turned to the Afghans. The Afghan Air Force pilots that we were training, they had to be housed on a base in Uzbekistan because they were being assassinated wholesale on the street. And we had just pulled back and said, we're no longer a part of this. So guess what? If our guys got hit, it was more or less, it was one of the splinter groups. It was ISIS or it was somebody else that hit us, because the Taliban basically was laying off of us because they knew we were going. The Taliban was more popular than the government, certainly than us, and the government in Kabul. It's interesting, about sometime almost a decade ago, the chancellor of the NDSU system wrote an article that said that they did a survey in one district and 53% of the people supported the Taliban, and the rest of the support was divided up among all sorts of other people. And unless something changed and we learned about rule of law, et cetera, they took on rule of law, it wasn't going to change, and that we were really in trouble. Well, guess what? We were really in trouble because you couldn't engineer the kind of changes that had to be, no matter how hard we tried. And I mean, it was a good, honest effort, but no matter how hard we tried or what we did, Afghanistan was still going to be a fractured place. Okay. And I cannot tell you how staggering the corruption was. I'll tell you what used to infuriate me. People that weren't even putting troops on the ground, we were letting contracts, NATO was letting contracts, and people were picking up those contracts, multi-$100-million contracts for things that the Army really didn't want or anything else, and they were lining their pockets with mostly U.S. tax dollars. And not really contributing that much. I mean, the Germans, you know, the Germans helped some, but we had to find a place where they weren't likely to be shot at to send them. Okay, and so the Qatar talks and the corruption enabled the Taliban to make deals with local security and regional officials. Really good article in the New York Times that stepped through from one of the guys that was one of the frontline security guys. And he said, look, first of all, almost everybody on the front line was taking some kind of drugs, either meth or opium, because you couldn't stand it otherwise. And it was so corrupt behind us that when it really started to unwind, our commanders actually sold our positions to the Taliban. So this whole collapse is indicative of how hopeless the job was from the beginning. I mean, they didn't even hold up for the 2 years or so that the South Vietnamese army held up. It fell completely apart. And the Taliban ran a really good operation in setting it up. And in spite of everybody we had on the ground, we really did not have our head wrapped around how fragile it really was. I mean, Biden was told basically that the worst case was 6 months. What did it turn out to be? 2, 3, 6 weeks? I don't know. Not much. Okay. They had a cakewalk to Kabul because it wasn't worth dying for. Next. Speed of the collapse confirms the futility of nation building in Afghanistan. $2 trillion if you include military contractors. And remember, there's a lot of ex-military going in as contractors. We had 6,000 plus killed. And we've got what we've got right now, which is not quite as bad as where we were in 2001, but very similar. Okay, next. Now we've got politics and finger pointing, okay? But here's the bottom line. We are off the ground in Afghanistan. We're off the hook. We're no longer spending money, et cetera, et cetera. And we can rethink both our tactical and our strategic strategies and issues as they relate to Afghanistan. And it's not costing us an arm and a leg to do it, okay? So as painful as this has been, I see it as a net plus over the longer haul when you're looking at it. Now, people say, well, but U.S. credibility. I think that's simply wrong. There's little impact unless we were to withdraw from someplace like Syria, Iraq, the Gulf, where we've got a strategic intervention. And I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening at all. Most of the Gulf Arab states welcome the withdrawal and in fact enabled it if you look at Qatar, and it really is going to, over the long term, I think, help our relations out there because they believe they are where we should be focusing, which is, I think, correct because they have oil. And it keeps the global economy in balance. Intelligence issue. I think everybody was clueless on the timing, okay? And so I don't know exactly how in the world these guys managed this, the Taliban managed to set this operation up and run the whole thing and have everybody collapse and nobody could go to the powers that be and say, you know, even the generals that said, okay, well, I didn't want to pull out. But, you know, a lot of these guys are defined by the last 20 years of war in Afghanistan. And how do you say, I just spent 20 years of my life doing something that was destined to fail from the beginning, okay? But it's not good for the country to spend another 20 years trying to fix it. It can't be fixed. And so I think they really need to look at this and look at what the issues are when it comes to a fluid situation of trying to understand how can you have that many people on the ground with a great big embassy and all, and not actually realize that there was a real potential for it just to evaporate, for the regime to do that. For the president of the country to get on a private jet provided by the Emiratis and fly to Dubai, you know, good hotels in Dubai. Domestic fallout, naivete about predictable optics, okay? Like I said, the finger pointing going on, why didn't we know? Why did you make this decision? Blah, blah. It goes on and on. But here's the bottom line. Kabul had become the enemy, the government in Kabul had become the enemy of most of the people that live in Afghanistan. There's 26 or 28 million Afghans. And guess who had set the Kabul government up and was the primary support for the Kabul government? Us, right? And so you put yourself in the middle of a family feud that's been ongoing for about the last 3,000 years. And there's no way to come out of that looking good. It's a geographical term, not a state, people. Here's an ethnic breakdown, another one. A little bit different, it's a little fuzzy, but this is an ethnic breakdown to show you just how fractured it is. Slogans about sovereign challenge. This is one of the slogans we use because it was this whole idea of we were trying to create governments that were sovereign in their area, but if they're not, if they don't have anything really to work with, it runs completely against the reality here. Every group. You got to think strategic, back off and look at it and say, okay, where does this fit in the overall? Is it really worth this? What can we really hope to accomplish? Are we going to have to be here? I swear if we had been there 40 years and spent $4 trillion, we would have had the same result. The Taliban implies a monolith. How many times have you heard on the news, well, the Taliban this, the Taliban this? I will tell you this, there is no such thing as the Taliban. There are multiple Taliban, just like there was no such thing as the Communist Party. The Russians couldn't get the guy they liked. They kept shooting people to get the guy they liked because there was the Communist Party itself was so fractured. The same thing is true about the Taliban. They're already infighting. We need to learn to exploit this. Tack hammers over sledgehammers. I'll tell you why. I got a why question. Potential return to a safe haven for terrorism. But you know what? This isn't 1990. And we did learn one thing. We can completely destroy that state and dismember it in 3 months with a handful of CIA and soft guys if you take the gloves off. Okay? So anytime you look at them now, and even day before yesterday, it was the foreign minister said that they were not going to cooperate with the U.S. on counterterrorism matters because the Taliban government was capable of handling Daesh all by itself. Okay, I don't believe that. But the fact that he used the term Daesh to describe ISIS is a very pejorative term, a very pejorative term. In other words, it's an extended 4-letter word in describing. And as a result, that tells you there's more than a little friction there. And here's the other thing. Do you think for 1 minute we're going to allow somebody to set up bases and training like Al-Qaeda did back in the 1990s and not do something about it? Really do something about it? No, that would be, we don't have to go in there and try to fix the place. We just have to go in there with a sledgehammer and smack the guys that are a threat to us if we have to do it. We ought to be judicious about that. And we ought to see how this pans out. And that goes back to my first thing. We need to look at the Taliban and what the fractures inside implies, primarily because of this security and terrorism issue. Because I guarantee you, I don't care what they call themselves, a barrel full of $100 bills will buy some loyalty. You can rent some loyalty. You don't own anybody, but you can rent somebody enough to get to your whatever your immediate problem is fixed. And they know that. They know that. That's what happened the first time. For now, Taliban is the enemy of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And they know, as I pointed out, we can do what we did in 2001 again. We can do what we did. Not worry about trying to fix the place, just put them out of business for a while. And then they have to think about it. And they really did not expect that. And they really, really regretted what happened, I think, particularly the political guys in the regime. You have some ideologues that you're not going to change anything. But I think it was a shock to them. And they don't want another shock like that. Next. How many times do I have to say this? Afghanistan is still Afghanistan. Infighting and the coming civil war can be taken advantage of, and we need to be in a position to do it. but not with a bunch of troops on the ground. This is a special operations, a proxy, a intelligence war that's coming, and not putting 125,000 troops on the ground. I had one retired U.S. colonel tell me he knew we had lost in Afghanistan, not when they put the PX up at Bagram, but when they started painting parking spaces on the parking lot and handing out tickets. And so something to think about. Afghanistan 2.0, idealism replaced by, look, the West, Europe, and certainly the United States has done a really, I mean, we've got a long way to go, but compared to everybody else, we've done a really outstanding job when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to having, and this is a comparison thing. I'm not talking about, is everything fixed? No, it's not. But in comparison to Afghanistan or to somewhere else, we can't fix those societal problems there. We can't do it. They have a society, we literally don't have the resources to be able to recreate something, even if we thought we could. What we need is hard-nosed, ruthless realism and self-interest. If they've got somebody there that's a threat, we do whatever we do to knock them down, okay? But we don't go trying to fix the place and turn it into something it's not. We need to make the Taliban a problem for our regional adversaries. You hear about the slaughter of Shia on the Iranian border. These guys hate the Iranians. Remember when I pointed to the Iranians as a regional strategic problem? There's all sorts of potential. These guys are potentially, their ideas are potentially a problem for the Russians in their southern area, their Muslim areas. A potential problem for China, who's doing everything it can to suppress its Muslim minorities. And we have to remember that up until 9/11, our biggest allies in the Middle East tended to be traditional Islamic Muslim fundamentalists, not crazy guys like Al-Qaeda, but even Al-Qaeda fought beside us, even though they didn't like us, okay, back in the Afghan war. And so we need to rethink how we look at all of this and get over our 9/11 shock and think about how you use this strategically to improve your position and to undermine the position of those people that are challenging. Here's your ethnic breakdown of Afghanistan. Here is the Soviet war and the map of the Soviet war and the areas where the Russians were having to fight off the attacks that we were organizing and paying for and providing Stinger missiles to the guys opposing. This is CIA map of what was under control and what wasn't. The red areas were the only areas that were controlled. You see, and in those days, the USSR came right down to the border. Now, this is a little bit garbled, but this map right here, the light green areas show the areas that, quote, the government controlled. Now, I think we can be a little bit suspect about that right now, looking back. But let's say that's right. And then the purple areas are the areas that the Taliban controlled. And then the yellow areas are all that's contested. There is, other than this border area, which the Russians had direct access to, I think you could argue that pretty much the same problem for whoever's trying to run a thing there. In other words, you go back 40, 50 years and it's the same problem. You can't create two fractures. Expense of military forces has been saved. This is the pluses. We're in a stronger posture in critical strategic areas. This will come, okay? Iran, China, Russia now faced with the potential of Muslim fundamentalism. We got an opportunity here. We can't make it too obvious, but we got an opportunity here. Potential for US to exploit Islamic group divisions. I mean, if there is a problem, they still have ethnic, ideological, tribal, and there are factions that we can use to our advantage. if we need to get involved. Okay. And I think we should stay involved, just not expensively involved. In other words, when I say involved, I mean, this has become an intelligence and potentially a special operations problem. Withdrawal is supported in the Arab Gulf. I really think most of the Arab Gulf supports this. And the reason is they thought we shouldn't have been there in the first place, at least some really senior. I taught at the Saudi War College, and some really senior Saudi generals thought this was really a bad idea. And so I think that there is kind of a little relief as long as they don't see us doing anything dramatic in the Gulf. And why would we? I just wrote an article for Cambridge in their Manara magazine on the Gulf. And it basically is most of the troops that we have in the Gulf right now are being paid for by the Gulfies. So we're not out any money, right? Pretty good deal, right? We get to protect our interests, protect their interests, and we have these great staging areas, and it doesn't cost us. It costs us marginally some money, but I imagine it's mostly paid for. Now, in case you didn't know, the first Gulf War, the Bush 1 fought, we made money on that war. You know, all that stuff and all those troops with it. After the Gulfies got through paying us, we actually made money, a plus for the Treasury. You can be smart about this. Just we haven't done it recently, like since, I don't know, 92. Next. Focus on the Persian Gulf. Oil is paramount. Focus on Iranian aims in the Levant and Gulf. In other words, curtail them. Better realistic options for Iran and its nuclear program. That's what we really better think through, is what we're going to do and how. Hey, and by the way, we're not invading Iran and trying to turn Iran into some kind of democracy or something with 90 million people. I suggest that we take a lesson from invading Iraq and Afghanistan and rethink that one. We just may need to go in at some point if we have to, and clean their clocks, okay? Focus on critical allies, Kingdom Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Kuwait. And for their own good, we got to get the Saudis out of Yemen. That's a mess. They're never going to be able to accomplish anything of substance. And it's just a problem for them. What next in Afghanistan? War without end, that's done. No recognition, but CT ops with Taliban is in our interest. And I'll say this, with or without them, because the Taliban really does not want ISIS and Al-Qaeda running around. And they may have officially said, we don't want any help. But there's official and unofficial, and we need to figure out how we make those things work in our favor. Advantages, there's real advantages vis-a-vis Iran, China, Russia, Pakistan, I think, if we go in there. Because you got to remember, the Pashtun also are in Pakistan. And that's been one of the issues with Pakistan all along, is they've been harboring those people. It wasn't an accident that bin Laden was hiding out in Islam, near Islamabad. Be prepared to unilaterally go after the radicals. If we've got radicals that are really a threat to us, go after them, okay? But we really think about it and make sure we do it right, okay? Don't get bogged down again. Support EUR Qatari role in there. And here's why. EUR has more at stake right now than we do because of immigration issues and because of drugs. And so I think what we ought to do is keep doing kind of the normal things, but really watch what happens here and listen to what they're saying about where it's going. Don't take their word for anything, but listen to where we think it's going and let them bear some of the effort to deal with the post-collapse Taliban government. And I think that, I think there's some potential there, a little patience. U.S. empire. Hey, we got an empire, people. I hate to tell you this. People want to pack our bags and go home, forget it. You can't do it. You'll pay for it. So we need to focus, though, our little empire on the possible, not the ideal. We tend to get off on some kind of ideal or some kind of bizarre. You need to look at a place and say, can we really do something here? Among our regional allies, general relief. We're out of the quagmire, and they hope for us to shift to our regional strategic interests. And that's what I think we will do. We are in the process of doing. It'll be interesting to see. Afghanistan grew out of the necessity. We had to destroy the old Taliban regime and Al-Qaeda. We had to demonstrate it. US idealism created Mission Impossible. That overreach will make it harder to act on future threats. Don't get this and this confused. What'll happen is the next time, I can hear it now, next time we need to go do something, everybody will say, oh, well, you remember what happened. Well, that only happens if you're not using your head and the decision makers aren't using their head. Remember, everybody was really upset because Bush 1 stopped short of Baghdad back in '91. And I always loved Jim Baker, the Secretary of State. They said, well, this is about 2005. And they said, well, is there any good that's coming out of this second invasion by Bush 2 of Iraq? And Baker said, yeah. He said, nobody asked me why we didn't go to Baghdad anymore. But he's right. He's right about that. So that's really not getting the necessities confused with overreach and Mission Impossible. We are an empire. We still have to do things, okay? The day may come when we have to do in Afghanistan what we did in 2001. But then we don't need to hang around and get ourselves embroiled in trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, right? I put some stuff up here that I thought you might be interested in. This, The Ninth Company, is one of the most interesting movies out there. It's Russian. It is brutal. It is crude. It is really, really on the mark as far as it's about the recruitment of specialized volunteer Russian paratroopers that went to Afghanistan near the end of the war. And it's really, really interesting. So I really like this movie because, you know, you could almost make it, if you've seen The Outpost, but it's, you got to put a warning on it. I mean, it is really, really crude and really brutal, but I suspect pretty accurate. Old Max Bearden is former head of Soviet ops at the CIA, and he wrote this book called The Main Enemy, talking about the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan plays a big part in it. But you get a feel for how we were using Muslim fundamentalists, anybody that would side with us, and coming up with new things like donkey bombs, et cetera, to destabilize the Russians. So interesting perspective from back in the 70s and 80s. Fiasco. This is really about Iraq, but it's how the shift occurred from Afghanistan to Iraq and everything that went into it. And Rick's is really, really first rate. He's got a Pulitzer Prize for one of his books on the Marine Corps. He's got this book. He's got The Gamble on the surge in Iraq. But this is really more to look at the early phases of how the shifts occurred and how we ended up focusing on Iraq as opposed to Ghost Wars. The Call book, 2004, it's dated, but it's interesting. It's not right at the top of my list, but it's interesting. This just came out on 9/11, and this is really a good documentary if you can find it. Maybe on demand, on cable, CBS. It's the story of, and you have real people that I know in there arguing with each other about whose fault it was in the end that we say that Al-Qaeda, that the OBL and company managed to knock those buildings down in New York, and why we messed that up, why we didn't catch any of that. But it's really, really interesting to me because institutionally you see these arguments, et cetera, between people. Good documentary. The Outpost, that's a good one. It's about stranded U.S. troops in a new push, a new push to get the Taliban under control, and how it created a near disaster, and how in the end it ended up tactics being changed because they realized it wasn't working. But it's a really good, very violent, okay, a really good movie. War Machine, this is a parody on General McChrystal. And I think it's accurate in this respect. If you're given a mission and you go in there and you say, it takes X amount of men and whatever to get this done. And that's what he did. There were a whole bunch of people that didn't want it that passed it up. Okay, now remember it's a parody on it, but it speaks to an issue. And that is that at some point he said, yes, I've got what I need. Then within 6 to 8 months, he's saying, I've got to have this more and I've got to have that, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not being supported, by the Obama administration. And Obama and them were smart enough to record the entire meeting with him, where he was asked 4 times by the president, do you have everything you need? Do you have everything you need? And every time he said yes. It's this propensity to say, yes, I can do the mission, take any hill, et cetera, rather than backing off and saying, whoa, wait a minute, there's 26 million Afghanis, and I've asked for 125,000 troops. Now, how do I think this is going to work, right? That's one of the issues. And that's why interventions like this should be political with military intelligence, whatever inputs on it, because it's really an issue. It's really an issue. And of standing up and saying, yes, I can do it, when really you had no shot at being able to pull off really what you wanted to do. Lone Survivor, everybody's seen that. You know what I like about that movie is it's about an entire special forces unit basically getting wiped out, and how the lone survivor is saved by a Pashtun tribal type who just doesn't buy into the Taliban, whatever. But what I see in this is you see multiple helicopters going down, you see all of these people getting killed, and no matter how many of the Taliban you killed, they kept coming. No matter how many you killed, they kept coming. And so it leads you to realize that no matter what happens, they weren't going to quit. And imagine communities. Now, this is something totally different. It's a treatise on nationalism. We always talk about national states and sovereign state. And it basically says that nationalism is an imagined community, that it doesn't really exist, that there are all these interests that are combined, and that somehow somebody comes up with a mantra that gets people to go out and die for this ephemeral idea of the national state. And Arnold argues that Anderson argues that the best example of this is the United States. And I would argue that going from the draft to the all-volunteer army was a recognition on the part of Nixon and Kissinger at the time that you couldn't fight extended wars if you were sending people's sons and daughters out there. Because if you use people that had volunteered and they started complaining, you could say, hey, man, you volunteered. And I think it's been good in some ways, but in other ways, it's left us one with a military that, to some degree, is detached from the mainstream of the society. It's allowed the society not to be invested in these political decisions that get made, like Iraq and Afghanistan and, et cetera, where if it were their sons and daughters going, there might be a different political ramification to it. And at the same time, it's put the military or the powers that be in a position where you can fight a war for 20 years and spend $2 trillion and have exactly what to show for it, that you could have had to show for it 15 years ago. I'm not afraid to go out and do what we need to do. And we had to destroy that original Taliban regime. And we may have to destroy this one. But what I'm saying is that when I've got two old guys that have been everywhere, that I really trust their judgment on the ground, and I'm sitting there and they're both sitting there saying, this is not going to end well, we need to get out. And it's 2005 or 2006. I wonder why somebody wasn't listening to go in there and really say, hey, let's reevaluate what we're trying to accomplish here and what we really think the end result is going to be.